Welcome to Beyond the Lab. My name is Kate Stewart, and I'm here from the Office of Career Development in the Biomedical Research, Education, and Training Department of the Vanderbilt School of Medicine. I'm here today with Andrea Bauman-Carnegie, and she was a 2000 PhD graduate of the Department of Pharmacology. And we're glad to have you back. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So tell me about your what you did here at Vanderbilt.
So I did my PhD training here at Vanderbilt in the laboratory of Randy Blakely, and I studied monoamine transporters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and in particular the regulated interaction between the catalytic subunit of protein phosphatase 2A and the serotonin transporter.
Okay, so what was your path after your PhD?
So my path after started out on a pretty traditional trajectory for an academic scientist. So I thought I wanted to go and be a bench scientist, and so I did a postdoc. I did my postdoc at Oregon Health Sciences University in Portland, Oregon, at the Volum Institute in the laboratory of John Scott. And I studied A kinase anchoring proteins and signal transduction pathways.
Okay. And you are doing now what?
I am now the Director of Administrative Operations for the Center for Clinical and Translational Science at the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Okay. And so you are the Director of Administrative Operations. What does that mean? What do you do? Like, what do you really do?
What do I really do, or what am I meant to do? As Director of Administrative Operations, I provide high-level administrative oversight for the center. My job includes overseeing the financial, operational, programmatic aspects for the center. Some of this is some basic administrative, post-award administration, personnel management. I also have a component where I'm involved with strategic planning for the center, trying to identify what our goals and missions will be, aligning our goals with the research needs at the university and at the NIH and our national funders. Right. Trying to keep everything aligned. I also play a role in developing programs and resources to meet these needs. So that's what I do, but really on a daily basis, I'm kind of like a firefighter traffic cop. I just put out fires and make sure everything keeps moving along at a pretty calm pace.
So what does that look like? Like if you were to go into work today, what would your day look like?
My day looks different every single day. Primarily at some point earlier in the week or earlier in the month, I would have sat down with the center directors and key stakeholders, and we would have outlined initiatives and projects that we want to do. And then I will spend the days subsequently trying to put that into play, make those projects happen and try to achieve those milestones. So I'll pull teams together and then help those teams work through all the problems that they're going to encounter, and making sure that they're meeting their goals. Okay.
So in your current role, if someone would be interested in pursuing your path, would they need to do a postdoc? Is a postdoc necessary for that role?
You know, I wouldn't necessarily say it's necessary, but I think it's helpful. There's a certain level of maturation, I think, that happens when you do a postdoc, and that translates beyond into other careers, that ability to really think on your own and to problem solve and to feel confident in yourself.
Okay. So as the Director of Administrative Operations, how is that a good fit for you and your skill set and what who you are?
It's a good fit because I enjoy planning and strategizing. I enjoy trying to figure out how to make things happen. And I get to do that a lot in my job. And I get to span a wide range of science. So our center focuses on translational science, which a lot of people think of bench to bedside, taking like laboratory findings into patients.
Right.
But there's another half of that translational spectrum, which includes taking what you find in human studies, seeing how that applies to clinical practice, health policy, to ultimately affect the change in health in populations. And so I had to learn a whole other spectrum. And on a daily basis, I might be dealing with someone who's doing drug discovery, someone who's working with the governor's office to develop healthcare policy. Mm-hmm. So it's always changing. And I like that. I like the the fact that it's I could be fairly flexible. I can manage my own time, although I spend a lot of times in meetings, and so sometimes I can't manage it. I have to work out how I'm going to do my time.
Okay.
But yeah, and you have to have good. I like people most of the time.
Okay, good.
You have to be a good people person to do this.
Good. What are the skills that you use from your PhD training that you use in your current job?
I think having an understanding, the training that I received, understand how science works, to plan experiments, to understand the scientific process is really important, because my job is to create an infrastructure, resources, services, and programs to help researchers meet their goals.
Right.
So to understand how science works helps me to put those pieces all together. So that's really important. Key things like communication, writing, being able to communicate findings to a broad array of stakeholders. So you may be talking to other scientists, you may be talking to scientists who study cancer, and then the next time you're talking to scientists who study behavioral issues. So you have to be able to speak to a lot of different groups, even community groups who have nothing to do with science, and convey your thoughts to them.
Okay. So tell me the steps that you took to get your current job.
Well, I'd like to say that they were planned steps, but some of them just sort of happened. So as I had mentioned, I did my postdoc in the Scott Lab at the Bauman Institute, and I had thought when I started that I would be a traditional trajectory to be an academic scientist. The shift from that trajectory really came whenever the lab I was working in was moving, and I didn't know if I wanted to move. At the time, it was a generous offer to move, but I had reasons to stay in Portland, and so I decided to stay. And I wasn't really keen on doing another postdoc. I wasn't really sure at that point that I wanted to run my own lab, so I looked at some alternative options that are in Portland, and they were limited, very limited. And so after looking at a number of options, I decided I took an administrative position at the KCI Institute, which is part of OHSU. And they had a retinal degeneration center there. And that center had a series of basic scientists that had animal models of retinal disease, and they had clinicians who had patient populations, and my job was to straddle that gap and to work with the scientists to do the animal studies and to work with the companies to usher that into phase 1 clinical trials. So it was an administrative position, so it had some basic pre- and post-award administration, but my scientific background really played into allowing me to help plan experiments, plan the trials, do the FDA applications and things like that. After a while, I decided I wanted to take some steps to further my career. I didn't know very much about clinical research, and so I took a class to get certified in clinical research techniques, and then I asked to be promoted to a research assistant professor. That allowed me to write grants and to serve as co-PIs on grants and write papers. And then I was asked to, and I agreed to help set up the Translational Clinical Trials Center. And this center was involved with designing and developing phase 1-2 clinical trials for retinal disease, helping to determine outcome measures and for multi-site trials. And in that case, it allowed me to expand my knowledge into more business aspects. So I had to figure out a business plan. How do I make this center operate? How does it become sustainable? How does it grow? What is it going to look like? It was really fascinating and interesting and totally not anything I had learned to do in the past. So it was all going well, and then as everything else was evolving, I was also evolving in my personal life. I got married, started a family. My husband finished his postdoc and took a faculty position at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And so we relocated. The chair of his department had mentioned, as I was looking for jobs, that UIC had just received funding from the NIH, and they had started this Center for Clinical and Translational Science, and thought that perhaps my background would be a good fit for that center. So I wrote to the director and said I was relocating, and if he had time, I'd like to speak with him, and they offered me the job. So
that's great. And that's networking, I'm sure, like putting yourself out there. And you're working with people every day. So what is your idea of networking? What does that look like?
Well, it looks different depending on really what your outcome is. My networking is really working with the different stakeholders at the universities, working with the deans, the provost, the chancellor, and trying to get my name known in that way, so that as opportunities come up to sit on panels or searches or things like that, that perhaps my name might be one of the ones that they come up with.
Okay, good. So interviewing, I'm sure you've had to do your fair share of that. Do you have any positive or negative experiences you'd want to share?
Overall, the experience have been fairly positive. They're nerve-wracking, as you can imagine. There's always things you wish you would have done better. Probably the worst experience I had was I was going to interview for a position in Miami, and I had been at the University of Miami. And I had been working with someone at their end to arrange the flights, and they had arranged a flight, and then they had to change that, and there was some back and forth. And so the day of the interview, I show up at the airport, and the airport didn't have a reservation for me because she had canceled everything and didn't reset them back up. So I couldn't show up to the interview. I couldn't tell you if it was a good interview or not because I wasn't able to attend.
Yeah, that's definitely a negative experience.
That was a negative experience. But, I ended up calling the people, explaining what happened, worked out some other plans and arrangements. But
okay,
it was awkward.
Yeah. So tell me about your work-life balance. What does that look like to you?
Sometimes it looks like a mess. The nice thing about my job is that it's fairly flexible, and it has fairly traditional hours. I spend a lot of time in meetings, which means I sometimes have to work, and often have to work in the evenings to kind of catch up on things that I didn't get to finish during the day. But it's an awful hard balance. I have 2 children, and they're young, and they require a lot of time. And I was very used to being able to work as late as I wanted to, and spend a lot of my evening catching up. And so it's been very hard adjusting to having to share that big chunk of my evenings and not have to work. So get very little sleep, but
make it work.
It gets done. Yeah.
Okay, good. So what words of wisdom would you like to give current trainees, current PhD students and postdocs as they start their job search?
I think that it's important to not, as you're going through your training, it's very important not to be held by the expectations that others have for you. You really need to look at what you enjoy and what you think you're good at and what you are good at, and try to find ways to build on that. But your skills that you develop as a student and as a postdoc are very applicable in a lot of ways because you're trained as a critical thinker. And that's what you learn. You learn to plan experiments, but you learn to interpret things and to project and to anticipate. And that's important skills no matter what you're doing. So I think that people need to know that they translate. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming back. We enjoyed having you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course.